For millennia, mankind has wrestled with hard questions. Where did we come from? What does it mean to be a good person? What's the meaning of life? And most importantly, is Quake 2 a shitty game? For most games, that's a pretty easy question to answer. Mario World isn't a pile of poopy, but Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is straight up doo-doo feces. But depending on who you ask and when you asked them, Quake 2 is either the hidden gem of the Quake franchise or a shitty tech demo masquerading as a sequel to one of the greatest games ever made. Reviewers at the time liked it, the community has always been in a civil war about it, and as a fan of Quake 1 and Quake 3, I'll be honest, I skipped it altogether. Between looking down my nose at it for being such a departure from Quake 1 and not wanting to do the 5 seconds of research and 30 seconds of installing the best source port, I figured I was just going to go to my grave without ever popping my Quake 2 cherry. That was until Night Dive decided to drop a fresh re-release that just works.
All of this just works.
So right here in 2023, I decided to finally jump into the Quake game I've watched forum wars about for decades and answer for myself. What's the deal with Quake 2? Let's start with some of the good things about Quake 2 because despite my issues with it, there's more good than bad. The shooting feels nice. I don't love every gun in the arsenal, but there's some real winners here. The super shotgun looks awesome, sounds awesome, and does just enough damage that it's a go-to weapon, but isn't so good that it's the only gun you're ever going to want to use. The rocket launcher is just as good as last time, but I don't like the redesign as much as the shotgun. The Quake 1 rocket launcher is peak old school shooter design, both in look and sound, and if it's good enough for this bastard, it's good enough for me. I was a little bit surprised on how much I liked the SMG.
Says the guy that had an Adolf amount of kills with the MSMC in Black Ops 2.
And hats off to whoever at Night Dive got rid of the third worst idea id ever came up with. And we can't forget the most iconic weapon that Quake 2 brought into this world, is what I would say if it wasn't stolen from a movie, and another game beat it to the punch. The railgun is an iconic weapon introduced to the Quake series here, and like the super shotgun, it sounds great, looks awesome, and is really fun to use, but for whatever reason, some absolute genius decided it was too strong and they nerfed it in the re-release. This is as sacrilegious as making the op a 2-shot kill to the chest or yeeting Mario out of the next Mario Kart. It's not something that should be considered, let alone actually done. Luckily, someone listened to everyone and reverted the damage so this thing slaps like it should. You know what else slaps? Skrillex's second EP, Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites. Despite receiving some unfavorable reviews by so-called professionals on its release in 2011, this EP would go on to change the sound of electronic and pop music for the next decade. Wait, that wasn't about Quake 2 at all. The movement. It's probably one of the most defining aspects of the Quake franchise. Bunny hopping, rocket jumping, air strafing, ramp jumping, and generally moving faster than Dale down the straightaway at Talladega is what defines these games. And Quake 2 keeps pretty much all that stuff from Quake 1, but changes up things slightly. I would say that 99% of players probably won't notice that there's a change at all, but if you're a movement player like our good old pal Peter,
look at me, I'm a movement player, Lois,
you'll probably notice that there are some changes. If you're a defrag player, you'll likely want to stick to Quake 1 for its familiarity and increased air control. But for everyone else, the Quake 2 movement system is a little slower, a little more complicated, but still just as fun as Quake 1. The multiplayer is also a lot of fun. I don't know if I would say it's more fun than Quake 1, and my go-to Quake multiplayer has always been Quake 3 or Quake Live, but between home lands with my brother and online games with randoms, this re-release is probably the easiest way to get into the multiplayer. That's something that I've really liked about these re-releases so far. Both this and Quake 1 turn multiplayer into a single-click experience. It reinvigorates these multiplayer communities. Old heads can relive the glory days of fragging noobs like it's 1997, while newer players can easily play deathmatch without having to go to some sketchy Discord where some 35-year-old mod tries to make them his kittens.
Who's my good little kitten?
I am.
Quake 2 definitely offers more in the multiplayer department than Quake 1, and at least in my experience, isn't as sweat-infested as custom Quake 3 stuff is. So if you want an old-school arena, CTF, TDM game where you won't get shit-stomped by some dude with literally 15,000 hours, Quake 2 is a pretty good place to start. The last thing I really like about Quake 2 is the music. I love the soundtrack of the original Quake. There's nothing quite as comforting as the sounds of schizophrenic psychosis, but Quake 2 decided to replace it with traditional rock and metal type music, and while I do miss the old stuff, this soundtrack kicks ass. The original 9 Inch Nails soundtrack would sound extremely out of place in the world that Quake 2 built, but the music by Sonic Mayhem fits the game perfectly. Quake 2 is probably the most dude bro Quake game outside of Quake 4, and the metal mixed with breakbeats fits way better than the serenades of a psych ward ever would. As you can see, that's a lot of good things about Quake 2, but that doesn't answer the main question. Is Quake 2 a good game? Well, like your grandma's underwear, it depends. If you want this to be Quake 1 Part 2, then the answer is no, and we'll get to that in a minute. If you're looking for a good late 90s shooter with all the trappings those games tended to have, then I think Quake 2 is a pretty good one of those. Despite what contrarians and Quake 1 purists on the internet might say, Quake 2 is more than a serviceable action game. The movement, shooting, and music are pretty great. Quake 2 plays really nicely if it was just some random 90s FPS. The problem is Quake 2 isn't just some random FPS. It's fucking Quake. Quake is a name that carries a lot of weight and expectations. Quake is a game with a unique atmosphere, vibe, and all-around feel. It brought the id formula kicking and screaming into full 3D and created a classic in the process. Unsurprisingly, Quake 2 is disappointing by comparison. The atmosphere is swapped from poop-colored castles and dungeons to poop-colored tech bases. The music is swapped from what I hear in my head during a mental breakdown to what Gen Xers consider the pinnacle of rock and roll. And the overall vibe of the game leans closer to Call of Duty than Call of Cthulhu. All of this makes Quake 2 feel very generic, even if each of these changes aren't necessarily bad on their own. The changes create a game that feels like a sequel to Quake in gameplay only. It would be like if the next Mario game controlled like Mario Galaxy, but instead of jumping through space, Mario was in fucking Detroit, where he has to leap across buildings to hit Princess Shadynasty with a sweet hit of that Narcan before the fentanyl takes her to the dead galaxy. Even if this game was mechanically fantastic, people will be rightly confused when Nintendo calls it Super Mario Galaxy 3. By calling this game Quake 2, it forces me to compare it to the original despite the games only really sharing a genre and name with each other. But I came into this game expecting Quake 2, and I'll be honest, I didn't love what I got. Long story short, it's not Quake 1 Part 2, but I also think it just feels different in a way that's hard to explain. Quake 2 feels professional and corporate in a way that I don't really love. Quake 2 is a little bit like listening to a restored or remastered recording of a band like Black Sabbath. Sure, it technically sounds better, it might be using higher quality recordings or more modern mastering techniques, but that makes it sound worse. Sabbath isn't supposed to sound clean, it's supposed to sound raw, frayed, and a little bit dirty. Up until Quake 2, that's how a lot of id games felt to me. They were the culmination of pizza, metal, Coca-Cola, and long nights for better and for worse. But that sort of charm is completely absent from Quake 2. In an effort to make things fit together better and have more cohesion, they ended up smoothing out all the texture that made previous id games so interesting. Part of why I love id games is because you can see the creator's fingertips all over the thing. Romero's levels are his levels. Adrian and Kevin's monsters look and move like only their monsters could. And Sandy's levels... well, no one makes levels quite like Sandy. The individuals at id were integral to what made id games so much fun to play, which is why their departure and disconnection from Quake 2 is felt so deeply. Some of the guys left, others were fired, and a lot of the guys who remained were so burned out from cranking out shooters every 12 months that the passion was just gone. A lot of Quake 2 feels like filling out boxes to get a game out the door. As fellow shooter degenerate Civi put it, Quake 2 feels like an id brand of shooter. shooter. There's the standard weapons, shotguns, rocket launchers, miniguns, the standard half-human, half-monster enemies, the standard dirty future tech-based sci-fi stuff. Quake 2 feels like what would happen if you asked ChatGPT to make you a stereotypical late 90s shooter, complete with the utter lack of character that only cold calculated computers can create. Quake 2 really feels like you had to be there for it. It feels caught between two eras of shooters with a foot in both sides. Some of it's looking to the future with an emphasis on story and a linear campaign, while some of it is looking to the past with big levels, secrets, and power-ups. It's simultaneously antiquated and forward-facing at the same time. To put time into perspective, a year after Quake 2, Half-Life came out, which does the Quake 2 linear campaign thing 10,000 times better than Quake 2 does. It does it well enough that I would still recommend it to people that are trying to work their way backwards through retro shooters. And a year after that, Quake 3 came out, which abandoned a lot of what made Quake, just like Quake 2 did, but it was such a large departure that it really felt like its own thing. By shifting 100% of the focus to multiplayer and introducing a lot of crazy shit, it didn't get as weighed down by comparisons to the first Quake game. It really set up its own identity. Quake 2 feels like a half step into the future that doesn't do enough to revolutionize the formula, or stick close enough to the old formula to be enjoyable for the arcadey action game that the first game provided. So that has me thinking, let's just take Quake 1 out of the picture. Let's set up an alternate reality where id never renames War to Quake 2. Instead, they release it as a whole new IP from them. I'd probably give it some shit for being mechanically too similar to Quake, considering it's supposed to be a whole new IP. But all the music, structure, and environmental changes would get more of a pass from me since it's supposed to be a whole new world. But the facts of the matter wouldn't change. The environment would still be very bland. It's not bland in comparison to Quake 1, it's just bland. And that's a huge problem because, like War, the environment never really changes in this game.
War never changes.
I know people give Quake 1 shit for being dark and dingy, but at least it's different types of dark and dingy. You go from Uncle Al's creepy shed to Joe Biden's basement, and they all feel slightly different.
And Corn Pop was a bad dude.
Quake 2's levels don't have that same amount of uniqueness to them. From a design perspective, they all feel pretty much the same. For better or for worse, the fingerprint of the designers is pretty much removed from this game. They all play very similar, and they all look extremely similar. 99% of Quake 2 is like, hey, look, it's pseudo-space Desert Storm, and that just doesn't get my cock throbbing. God made the desert for sand, not aliens. Speaking of aliens, the enemy variety would still be really bad too. From a visual design, these guys are all very similar. They're different in practice, and some of them do offer up some unique challenges, but on the whole, I found the cast of this game to be very unmemorable. There's an interesting level showing how these guys are made, and their lore is kind of interesting, but none of these guys are as iconic as the Shambler or the Pinky. But there's other things that Quake 2 really hits it out of the park on, even though I found the levels to be very visually bland and lacking in personality, which kinda makes them a slog to play through. The actual design of these levels is probably id at their most direct and efficient. There's secret areas and routes in these levels, but the invisible hand in Quake 2 is immaculate, to the point where I really wonder who needs the compass that they added in this re-release. Almost all these levels loop on themselves in a way that I never got lost or wondered where I needed to go, and I've never played this game in my entire life. The movement and shooting would still be awesome. It's very similar to Quake 1, but Quake 1 is awesome. The music would be awesome because, well, this shit slaps, and the multiplayer would still be fun even if they called it War. But at the end of the day, I'd still rather play Quake. Quake 2 is an example of a good game that I just don't care for. On its own terms, it's probably a 7 out of 10, but I can't look at it that way. Considering its younger and older brother, I just don't see a big reason to play Quake 2. It has its fans, but I'm probably never going to be one of them. Quake 1 was such a unique experience that it's one of the only times that I feel like more was the answer for a sequel. More monsters, more levels, more environments. That's what I wanted out of Quake 2. What I got instead was a game that shares many fundamentals, but without any of the same substance. I appreciate when a series wants to try something new. Things getting too formulaic can be a problem, but when a series knocks it out of the park with its first rendition, maybe it's a little early to go back to the drawing board and retool the entire thing. I don't regret my time with Quake 2, but I probably won't be giving it any more in the near future.
That's right, we're Japanese.